Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Alexander Scott. I am your host and a member of the Latin American Perspectives editorial collective. For today's episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Professors Kristin Ciupa and Jeffery about their new co-edited volume, The Labor of Extraction in Latin America, that was recently published by Rowman and Littlefield as part of their Latin American Perspectives in the Classroom series. Kristin Ciupa is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Regina and the author of the forthcoming book, The Political Economy of Oil in Venezuela, Class Conflict, the State, and the World Market, that will be published with Brill. Jeffery is a professor of politics at York University, Toronto. He is the author and co-author of 5 books and co-editor of 2 books. Most recently, he co-authored the book The Impasse of the Latin American Left with scholars Franck Gaudi-Chad and Massimo Modonesi. Although we were unable to cover all of the volume's insightful case studies, contributors, and debates, in our short conversation, Kristin and Jeff provided an incredibly informative overview of extractivism as a process, how and why such practices remain persistent features of the Latin American political economy, as well as the central role of labor in shaping national export sectors, economies, politics, and societies in Latin America. Now, let's get to the interview. Kristin and Jeff, welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Now, as some of our listeners might not be the most familiar with this topic of extractivism or extraction, will you please define and describe what extractivism entails specifically as a political economic process?
So when we talk about extractivism, we're essentially talking about the appropriation or removal of natural resources from land or nature. And so one thing that we do in the book is we distinguish between renewable natural resources, so something like agriculture, or non-renewable natural resources, so something like oil, gas, and minerals. In terms of a political economy focus, in terms of thinking about extractivism, we're interested in the dialectical relationship between extractive capitalism on the one hand, as it develops nationally, but then also influenced by the global market, and then the impact, on the other hand, that this has on national, social, and political formations, for example. So I'll give some background on that. When we talk about this economically, in the context of Latin America, we're focusing on the over-reliance on extractive sectors as a proportion of GDP. So this is an important consideration, is the strong reliance on extractivism, which is grounded in part in the historical emergence of extractive sectors. So I'll just talk about that very briefly to give some context of this. But essentially, many of the extractive sectors that we see today in Latin America that predominate, they were created and expanded in the early 1900s. They responded to growing demand for natural resources. And at the time, they became the way in which national economies were integrated into the global capitalist system. So development occurred unevenly in these countries as a result of this focus on extractive industries, where other resources, so maybe labor and capital, were drawn out of other sectors that might have existed, for instance, in agriculture, and focused into extractive sectors instead. So this is sort of the moment of how extractive accumulation comes to be in Latin America. And then the problems that exist perpetuate as a result of this relationship, where many of these countries rely on primary commodities as the main means of national income. And we see fluctuations in global commodity prices, for example, creating contexts of boom and bust in countries that they're unable to weather because they don't have other sectors that are financially weather the storm in these kinds of contexts. So this is the economic condition that exists. It's often called the resource curse, in terms where there's an abundance of a natural resource, but countries still tend to underperform economically due to these cycles in commodity prices. To briefly touch on the political and social formations and how this affects that at the same time, what we see at this moment of extractive sectors coming about is also a modern state formation in Latin American countries, where governments are consolidated often around extractive sectors. And what happens is that states tend to begin to capture a larger portion of state revenues from extractive sectors that again make up a large proportion of GDP in the countries. We can distinguish between something like oil, where it relies on heavy financial investment and technological capacity, and so it tends to be concentrated in a few key players, or something like agriculture, where there's broader participation in the market. But essentially what happens is there's a focus by different social sectors on capturing the state or aligning with the state in order to experience the economic benefits of this form of capital accumulation. And so one of the things that we explore then is social movements and labor unions and how it is that they might align or disalign with the state in order to perhaps have autonomy from the state or to be able to reap the financial benefits. So this is kind of the broader political economic context. And within that, we can start to talk about different political economic periods of extractivism that are influenced by things like international demand for resources and commodity prices, the political projects of elected governments, including how they distribute revenues, for instance, to the public, as well as the power that labor and social movements have in particular periods.
So with all of that in mind, why have extraction and the exportation of primary commodities been persistent features of capitalism in Latin America? And what have been the consequences of neoliberal economic restructuring for extractivism and extractive labor in recent decades?
We see the extractivism and commodity export as a persistent feature precisely because of how unevenly capitalism has developed in Latin America and the incentives then attached to resource extraction associated with it. So when commodity prices are high, the incentive to extract to a greater degree in order to increase profit making. So we see new extraction rates increasing when prices are high. It could be new exploration for new gas or reserves or mineral reserves, for example, mass hiring in extractive sectors. So there's always this push when commodity prices go up to expand these kinds of sectors. And this has a ripple effect across the economy in terms of there being more money for goods and services, the expansion of other sectors, typically the state, and typically the expansion of public sector employment at the same time. Even when commodity prices decline, we still see the maintenance of these sectors because we know that they are cyclical. So prices will eventually go up. And often what governments will do is they'll rely more heavily on private investment, or they'll open up the sectors more so to private investments in moments of economic downturn in order to sustain the industries. So that's why still in these moments of economic downturn, we see them as a persistent feature of capitalism in the region. When we think about neoliberal restructuring and the impact it's had on extractivism, in general, this has been a moment, it was a moment of lower prices in terms of primary commodities and a decline in profitability across the board. So this was a moment where extractive sectors were liberalized and they were opened up to more private investment. In oil, gas, and mining, this might have manifested as privatization of aspects that were previously nationally controlled. So things like exploration, extraction, or even transportation of resources. In agriculture, this would have been liberalization and the inclusion of agribusiness, which dispossessed many indigenous people and peasants from land in the countryside. So that's the context of how it affected extractivism. When we look at labor in particular, we see that what happened was a lot of the crises of profitability under neoliberalism were resolved in ways that resulted in cutbacks to social spending and led to the informalization of work. So with the inclusion of more private companies, they often weren't subject to the same kinds of requirements as the private sector. So there were weakening labor and environmental regulations. And part of this was to attract foreign companies to invest as well in the industries. There was a massive informalization of work characterized by a lack of employment security, an absence of work contracts for workers, and deteriorating conditions in general. So there was a creation of a mass reserve army of informal workers And added to this were people that had moved from the countryside, that were displaced from traditional livelihoods in the countryside, moved to cities, and they added to this mass of informal workers as well. For labor organizing, what this tended to do is it led to a fragmentation between different sectors of the working class. So with the rise of informal workers, we saw a decline in some of the organizational power of traditional working class unions, because informal workers no longer had the same employer, for instance, that they could organize around and advocate for certain needs, for example, or certain material gains. So there was a fragmentation between full-time workers and precarious workers, particularly related to conditions of temporary or precarious work, where workers might have been commuting, they might have only been at the job for a short amount of time, for instance. So all of these things deterred organizing in the way that we would traditionally think of it. Alongside this, perhaps attempts by employers at certain points to divide workers through different salaries or bonuses or benefits, and prejudices within unions sometimes about organizing with informal workers themselves. So all of these things were affected by neoliberalism. And one last thing of note as well is that there was a large rise in migrant workers as well. So if we see this rise in informal work and a reserve army of workers that couldn't find work within their country, we're seeing a rise in the context of people moving abroad to try to find work, and an increase in remittances as migrant workers send money back home to their home countries.
In this edited volume, you make I believe, the important intervention of inserting a explicitly Marxist analysis of labor into the debates about extractivism and political economic development. Now, in order to unpack this intervention for the listeners, could we first just very briefly discuss and explain the general Marxist understanding of labor exploitation, productive labor, the extraction of surplus value, etc.?
So on this, we make three basic distinctions between productive labor, labor in general, productive labor, and social reproductive labor. And part of this is to specifically identify our interest not in extractivism transhistorically understood, i.e., the many hundreds of years of extraction, but the particular form of industrial capitalist extraction and productive labor inside of it. And then even more particularly, the very recent several decades, that is the concentrated focus of the book. So labor in general, in Marx, who we follow in this conceptualization, is a concept that involves all intentional, conscious, creative, and imaginative life activity, distinctive to the species being of humanity, what he calls the species being of humanity. So, and this has to do also with our necessary biophysical interaction with non-human nature. Okay, so human life couldn't go on in any historical period without such a biophysical interaction with the natural world. That is the productive appropriation of certain aspects of the physical world, including animals, plants, water, land, and so on, and a natural world in which humans are a part of, right? So this interaction of humans with the non-human nature is premised not merely on instinct in this conception of labor, but also a conscious awareness of our needs and the ability and intent to design specific ways of meeting these needs. So this distinguishes, as Marx argues, this distinguishes us from most non-human animals, right? So not merely an instinctive relationship to nature, but a conscious, aware, designed, intentional interaction. Okay, so as the basis of our species being, human labor, then in this sense is understood as life activity, and is therefore existential, constitutive of humanity's relationship, both with non-human nature and constitutive of our relationship with other humans, being social individuals, all of us, right? As a species, necessarily social. So as these relationships change, so too does the character of labor and its degrees of freedom and equality, right? So the problem then is not, as we see it, labor per se. As in some formulations, the idea is to get out of the necessity of labor. But for us, labor is life activity. The problem is the alienated form it assumes under capitalism, right? And likewise, the alienated and degrading form that our social metabolism with non-human nature assumes under capitalism. Some kind of social metabolism with nature is absolutely necessary. So it's not about somehow avoiding a relationship with non-human nature. It's unavoidable to our species, right? So that's the first thing at a very basic but important general level, right? So the aim is an unalienated life activity, a self-determined taking back control of both our relationships with each other and with non-human nature. So that's the premise, which is a trans-historical conception of labor. Then the real focus of the book, though, I mean, analytically, is productive labor. And here, and even more specifically, productive labor in the export production complex. Okay, so this is what we identify as the enormous gap in the literature on extractivism thus far. So in this, we depart from an axiomatic premise, which says that productive labor constitutes constitutes the heart of the matter as the source of value under capitalism, including capitalism in its extractive form. Okay, so by productive labor, and we're only now referring to industrial capitalism, by productive labor, we've referred to labor that directly creates value in the Marxist sense, that is, labor which produces value that can be measured economically from the standpoint of capital, where value is the surplus or extra that returns to capital beyond its expenditure. Okay, so it is, in other words, the growth of capital after accounting for all the expenses in productions. So the surplus in question that is generated in every cycle is directly traceable to workers. Okay, so the worker produces more value than is needed for the reproduction of their own labor power because they work in excess of the time it takes to create that value. So in light of competition with other capitals, the capitalist is driven to expand their business to reduce the labor time necessary for the worker's subsistence and increase the rate of exploitation. That is the time of the day that the laborer is working for this surplus, for the capitalist, which the capitalist expropriates. And this is true of all capitalist industry, but it's also true of extractive industry. So natural resources aren't just gifts of nature, they're expropriated through productive human labor, right? So within the logic of capitalist system, the entire driving force behind production is this necessity of expanding capitalist value. And the source of this value is productive labor. So the entire driving force is the valorization of capital itself. So value is created through the production of goods and services for the market. And that is what we mean when we say productive labor that is producing goods or services for sale on the market for profit, appropriated by a capitalist. Now, this is distinct from our final analytical move, which is to distinguish it from social reproductive labor, right? So this is not this is distinguishable from not-for-profit social reproductive labor, which can be paid or unpaid, which is explicitly not labor set in motion to produce a commodity for sale on the market. So social reproduction or social reproductive labor here is the work involved in maintaining and reproducing human life. So under capitalism, most of this labor has been performed unpaid by women within the family unit. But portions have also been carried out to different degrees in different social formations and historical periods um, by the welfare state or through the market, with variations in this traceable to the degrees in part of feminist struggle. So what feminists have been able to achieve in this domain. So in conclusion about these three analytical distinctions, then social reproductive labor and productive labor are absolutely necessary for the reproduction of capitalism. And by definition, labor in general, life activity, is just something that we are always doing socially under any historical system. And a full account of labor in any particular historical situation, therefore, needs the kind of total conceptualization of social reproductive and productive labor. But in this book, analytically, knowing that this is a partial analytical lens, we focus on productive labor, not to diminish the importance of social reproductive labor, but merely as a response to the already significant attention to social reproductive labor and social reproductive struggles in recent decades on the question of extractivism, particularly fights around land, life and capital, and so on, with the relative dearth of attention to productive labor. So it's not, the analytical point is not that productive labor is somehow the only thing to focus on, but that this has received relatively little attention in recent years. And finally, just that there's a debate running through the text that some people who contributed to the volume don't agree with us, that it's useful to analytically separate social reproductive and productive labor in the way that we have. And so there's an open kind of through line of debate and attention in the book. But that's the theoretical angle that we take in the introduction.
Now, with that in mind, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how has the literature, how has much of the literature on extractivism, how has it overlooked the productive labor as a category? And why is it so important that we reintroduce this category to an analysis of extractivism in Latin America?
So there's a vast amount of literature that looks at class conflicts under neoliberalism around extraction and production and responses to problems of neoliberalism, as well as the pink tide as an alternative. But we found that the question of labor in those texts was largely absent. So some of the focus has been on social mobilization and struggles against extractivism, the relationship between those kinds of struggles, for example, by indigenous people and peasants, local resistance against extractive projects, and the relationship between those and the election of pink tide governments, for example. So the rise in extra-parliamentary social movements, how they resisted different facets of neoliberalism, including extraction, and how they influenced the election of progressive governments, new forms of resource nationalism, where natural resource sectors were increasingly nationalized or brought under state ownership, and the ways in which the benefits, the financial benefits of those sectors are then distributed to the public in ways that sought to reduce poverty or social inequality. So we take those texts and incorporated them into the work, but again, we have more of an explicit focus on labor. And the reason for that is in this focus on productive labor that we take in the book, where we're treating productive labor as a category that sustains capitalist accumulation itself. So under this Marxist conceptualization of value and economic labor, we see that it's workers that create value. And so they're the source of surplus accumulation under extractive accumulation. So this is why we focus on them in particular. We question, for example, when we look at the structural limitations of extractive accumulation and this impulse towards perpetual extractivism and resource dependency, focusing on labor then enables us to consider what are the effects of class conflict or worker agency as an integral driver of historical change under these structures of extractivism. Likewise, in the context of neoliberalism, where we're seeing a fragmentation of labor and a decline in traditional workers' organizations, bringing labor into focus allows us to look at what new forms of labor organization are emerging and what kind of power workers hold at the current conjuncture to alter forms of extractivism and the social conditions and political conditions that permeate. So to do this, we bring in a couple of concepts relating to worker power from Eric Olin Wright. We bring in the concept of structural power and associational power. Structural power being the potential of workers at key points in production to create work stoppages, and then to be able to influence extractive accumulation in that context. So we reconsider this concept in the context of increasing automation, for example, where there are fewer workers in these types of positions, in the context where we have more informal workers that have less workplace protections and less job security to engage in collective action. And we also consider workers' associational power. So, how it is that workers might develop an understanding of common interests and then work together to achieve those types of changes in the workplace. So, the idea being that structural power is activated when workers develop sufficient associational power to work together. And so, in the context of this kind of question under neoliberalism, the question becomes, when we see this dualization between formal and informal work, how do these disparate groups, how do they come together in some instances to recognize common interests in terms of restructuring the labor movement in a new way? How is it that informal workers organize if they don't have a formal employer to organize against, for example? What are these new forms of organizing look like? How do they relate to both the workplace as well as the political arena? And so one of the things that a number of authors talk about in the book is the ways in which informal workers are actually organizing in ways that influence the political arena. So without having the same kind of formal workplace and being able to organize the labor movement in the economic realm, that the ways in which informal workers are able to organize to have their interests represented collectively through state policy, for example, during the pink tide period or more recently, as well as the ways in which informal workers might align with activists, for example, or other social movements and groups to increase their associational power in that respect as well.
Now, among the many ideas I find interesting contained in the book is this idea that you highlight in the introduction of the triadic dialectic of capital, land, and labor. And could you explain the relevance of this framing to theorizing extraction and labor in political economy in Latin America? And how does this framing of the triadic dialectic, how does this differ from traditional Marxist approaches or orthodox Marxist approaches to the capital-labor relation or the capital-nature relation?
Great. So here we're drawing on the work of Fernando Coronil, who uses this idea, and he in turn is drawing on Marx, but a particular reading of Marx, which is not everyone's reading of Marx. So. And this relates back to some of the points we were saying around our distinctions of different forms of labor. But Coronil is responding to what he saw to be a restrictive dialectic, what he called a closed dialectic around the capital-labor relation, to the exclusion of land, which he understood following Marx in a particular way, not as land in the colloquial sense, but land including all kinds of nature, so non-human nature. So not simply agricultural land per se. So let's just say land as non-human nature in this triadic dialectic. Okay. So he wanted to include this because although he recognized and didn't disavow the notion that value was produced exclusively by productive labor, not non-human nature. Nonetheless, material wealth, as distinct from value that is produced, is found in nature, right? And nature contributes to the material wealth that is the material foundation of capitalist production. So without an understanding of this and the commodification of non-human nature, we can't have a full apprehension of these processes, both at the scale of this or that country, but also in terms of the international division of labor, which Coronil hopefully helpfully conceptualized also as an international division of nature, right? So this relates back to our foundational ideas of humans' necessary social metabolism with nature. Here, Coronil and others, here we're also following Andreas Malm in debates on this question, which argue that we can make and we need to make an analytical distinction between society and nature, but without missing that they simultaneously form a unity. Okay, so they form a unity, but they are not reducible to one another. So what does this mean? It means that while the properties of the social or societal properties are ultimately dependent on natural properties, humans are also a part of nature and made up of material natural properties. The inverse is not true. Okay, so the social is made up of material, and the material world is at base natural, with nature having existed long before society's emergence. Something social must have something natural as its substratum. Being material means being bound up with nature. If relations of production are material, they are also by definition built on and maintained through the natural. So again, the problem is not that we as humans have some kind of social metabolism with nature, which is unavoidable based on our species being. The problem is the form that this assumes under capitalism, which degrades both non-human nature and humans simultaneously, right? It degrades us. It alienates us from our own life activity, which is appropriated by capital, as it degrades non-human nature, and in the drive for the self-valorization of value, also will do this incessantly and without end, right? Both the degradation of us and the degradation of non-human nature. So in order to understand this at all, you can't simply look at the capital-labor relation. We need to bring in the question of land or non-human nature, which is how land is understood in this sense. Now, what we were responding to was a different problem than the period when Coronel was writing, because the problem in the contemporary literature, as we saw it, was not an excessive focus on the capital-labor relation, but the capital-land relation in that equation. That is, they went from one closed dialectic, capital-labor, to another closed dialectic, capital-land or capital non-human nature, to the exclusion of productive labor. So we're trying to avoid this kind of moving from one false binary to another, right? And open this up in the way that Coronel suggested. So ultimately, the idea of focusing on the commodification of land, labor, and capital together is to apprehend the relational character of the units included in the making of contemporary extractive capitalism in contemporary Latin America.
In the introduction, you describe Burkise's important work in writing on economic variation in development and labor organization within Latin American societies. And you highlight this as an important point of departure for theorizing the labor of extraction. Could you briefly explain the utility of Burkise's theory or model, and how scholars might improve upon and stretch this work moving forward?
Great. So Charles Burkise was a who recently passed away a few years ago, was a social historian of labor, and wrote a number of very important books. But we draw mostly on one book in particular, which was a seminal text, Labor in Latin America, and it had essays on some core countries, Argentina, Venezuela, Colombia, and Argentina, or I can't remember if I repeated Argentina, but anyway, four central cases in his framework, right? And Burki's basic analytical point of departure, historically, he's dealing with a different historical period than we are. He's dealing with the introduction and intensification of modern industrial capitalism in the export production complex from the 1880s until the mid 20th century, more or less. And our attempt is to move this forward to the period after he was interested in his reflections, but while maintaining this same kind of analytical approach, which we think has been too often forgotten in very recent years. So the basic thesis is disarmingly simple, right? That he advances. That is that workers in general, but especially those in the export production sector, played a determining role in the history of modern Latin American societies. So this is the first thing. I move away from technocratic approaches on state formation at the elite political level, or merely on the dimensions of capitalism, or on the dimensions of imperial policy, right? Workers themselves and their struggles for control of their lives, particularly those in strategically oriented sections of the export economy, played a tremendous role in their conflict with capital in these same sectors in determining the trajectories of Latin American societies. So this is just a basic thing. I mean, it's basic, but it's a basic element that is missed by too many, which is that you always need to begin somewhere in your analysis, and that point of departure should not be arbitrary. And for Burki's, it makes a lot of sense in the period he was looking at to focus on export production workers, right? Well, it makes a lot of sense to us in the period that he was not covering in the book, in the renewed attention to commodity production following the high point of import substitution industrialization, which has largely been eclipsed. The period of focus now is a similar attention to the activities in these sectors, but almost no one has returned seriously in a theoretical way to productive workers in these and struggles in these sectors. So we want to basically take Burki's cue and follow it in this direction. So his analytical point of departure was a combination of the insights of Latin American structuralism, so Latin American structuralist economists from the early 20th century, but infusing them with a Marxist emphasis on class conflict as the integral component of historical change. So his Latin American structuralism had a lot of insight into why it was that there was a focus on commodity export. But they weren't focused on class conflict in the same way, nor were they committed to a transformation of these class structures in society in an effort to transcend capitalism, which Burki was politically interested in and analytically interested in. So within the unity of export-oriented Latin America, Burki's move after this basic introduction is to identify 7 key factors that help to explain variation in patterns of economic development and simultaneously labor movement formation among different countries in the early 20th century. So what he's doing is looking at how these productive structures enable or inhibit the formation of working class consciousness and organization. And so he looks at geographic location and climatic conditions, nationality and concentration of ownership, capital intensiveness and technological sophistication, the degree of vulnerability to seasonal cycles and or world market fluctuations, the reservoir of surplus labor, ethnic composition and citizenship status of the workforce, and nationalism. Okay, so I won't run through the specific arguments he makes about all of these, but against this basic theoretical backdrop, he identifies 2 polar tendencies in Latin American societies in the period that he was interested in, and he plots a continuum between them. Okay, so on the one hand, he says foreign ownership and concentrated production tend to privilege culturally autonomous, class-conscious, and anti-capitalist labor organization among export workers, while simultaneously weakening prospects for economic development as a whole. On the other hand, he argues national ownership, low capital necessities, and diffuse production units tend to be an obstacle for labor organization in the export sector and anti-capitalist alliances more broadly, and thus improve the potentiality of overall economic development. So a country whose export economy closely approximates the structural features of the first scenario should consequently witness the development of a stronger, more anti-capitalist labor movement. Inversely, a country whose export economy closely approximates the structural features of the second scenario should witness the development of a fractured, weak, and ideologically co-opted labor movement. And he says, from this basic premise, you can start to map the 20th century trajectories of different Latin American countries. But he insists, and we want to emphasize this as well, that this abstract point of departure is merely a point of departure. It's a necessary one you need to abstract in order to identify where you begin analytically, but you need to be attentive in your actual analysis to the actual untidiness of historical development and not pretended away in your identification with the abstract model. Okay, so in that spirit, this isn't a mechanical, our project is not a mechanical appropriation or application of Burki's to the contemporary period as if nothing has transpired in the last decade since his book came out. We're very attentive to the transformations, as Kristin was pointing out, in the transformations of capitalism. Nonetheless, capitalism is still capitalism, and export productive capitalism is still export productive capitalism in Latin America, despite the many important changes. And so this analytical framework is still useful with that proviso that we are historically attentive to the untidiness of the situation. So that's the basic premise, and it's also a political premise in the sense that if the intent is to challenge the destructive character of extractive capitalism, not merely to understand it, we need to identify some of the agents, the social agents that might have the capacity because of their situatedness in these productive structures to call into question their reproduction, right? And one missing element, it's not the only element, and we don't argue it is, but one missing element is productive labor and the movements coming out of them, and why some are more militant in their challenges to contemporary extractive capitalism, and why some have have accommodated themselves to these structures in more enduring ways. And so that puzzle, we think, is key to unlocking not only our understanding, but the possibilities of transforming this, which has huge implications morally and politically, not just for Latin America, but indeed the world and our future. So we think it's important for those reasons.
Now, just to close out, I'm hoping that we can just provide a brief overview of what listeners can expect in the rest of the book beyond these sort of theoretical frameworks and concepts we've just laid out.
So what we do after our introduction in part 2 of the book is a series of chapters that revisit the same cases that Burki's visited in his original book, and everyone is explicitly engaging with Burki's framework. So there's a theoretical continuity between all of the chapters in the book, which doesn't mean agreement, right? There's ongoing debates, but there's a shared point of departure, and within that limit, there's all kinds of debate between the different contributors. But no one's challenging the idea that we focus on labor. That's the point of the book, right? But they have different conceptualizations of it. So we have Argentina, Venezuela, Colombia, and Chile, and a few different chapters on some of these cases, and in one case comparing Chile with Peru, which is something that Burkiss doesn't do in his framework. He focuses on Chile, but this is another angle. And then we extend the framework in part 3 to think about what this framework might involve, not merely in a temporal extension to the contemporary period, but also geographically to Mexico, a case that Burkiss didn't consider. So we have a chapter on Mexico, a chapter on Bolivia, which looks at tin miners from the high point of industrial unionism of the 20th century to their shift into cooperativism, which is a very interesting transformation, basically across Burkiss continuum. So the same social formation and same workers in the same industry moving from basically one of the more radical wings of the labor movement to one of the more conservative trajectories in terms of the cooperative sector, and then extending it to migrant labor power in the case of theorizing how labor across borders, because Burkiss, one of the limits of Burkiss was the restrictive character of the analysis to specific social formations contained within a state, right? Even though he was very attentive to how these states were incorporated into the International Division of Labor, he was still operationally thinking about comparative studies between state-bound social formations. So that chapter extends this into migrant labor power. And the last thing I'll say just is that we brought together a series of both sort of advanced, established scholars with earlier career scholars, and a number of Latin American contributors with North American experts on Latin America. So there's without pretending it's an exhaustive treatment because it's not a 1,000-page book, it doesn't cover everywhere in Latin America, but it is meant as the first step to open up a research agenda rather than sort of close the book on this. So that was the intent and the purpose.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, you guys, for making time to meet with me today. I look forward to promoting the book, finishing it, sharing it with my students, and I'll post in the show notes how listeners can get in contact with you. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks very much for having us and for the attention to the book.
Well, that is all the time that we have for today, but thanks for listening in. The Labor of Extraction in Latin America is available for purchase online through Rowman and Littlefield at rowman.com. Check the show notes for a link to where you can pick up a copy. To receive updates from our journal about new issues, articles, and podcasts, please be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And don't forget to subscribe and rate our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or your preferred podcast listening app. Hasta la próxima. Gracias.